Hey guys, welcome to another installment of Watercolor Crash Course. Last time I demonstrated several common, popular, and easy watercolor techniques that you need to know to be able to paint with watercolor. We talked about glazing, we talked about wet into wet, we talked about wet over dry, we talked about dry over wet, we talked about lifting out, we talked about masking, and we talked about different bloom techniques. Today, I want to show you guys how to take all of these techniques, or very many of these techniques, and combine them in a watercolor illustration. This isn't necessarily intended to be a tutorial, although you are welcome to paint along. It's more intended to be a demonstration of how these techniques can be combined to create a watercolor illustration. So today, we're going to be painting a field of wildflowers. To be doing a very technique focused illustration. This is really more geared to demonstrating various techniques and ways that they can be used, rather than, creating necessarily a piece that you're going to want to replicate. But hopefully it will do both. So I'm going to be painting a field of wildflowers. I figured that's something that could utilize a lot of different watercolor techniques and give me a chance to talk about them. And just for time's sake, I'm going to be doing the majority of this in time lapse, so it doesn't take us 6 hours. And obviously dry times are going to be cut out, but that is going to extend how long it takes you to finish a watercolor illustration. That's one of the big things I've noticed that people kind of struggle with. Well, there's a few things, but time is one of them, in that they don't realize how long it can take to do a watercolor illustration because we cut the dry times out, and they may go back in while the paper is still really wet without realizing it. So I wanted to kind of disclose that to you guys early on, and that might be something we discuss more when we do the troubleshooting live stream later on. So you guys should be fresh from our techniques tutorial. This is going to kind of build on that. So the materials we're going to be using today, and I am sure I'm going to grab more, and I'm going to have them listed out down in the description for you guys as well as links to where you can buy them. And I do want to disclose that Amazon affiliate links, I see a small bounty from that, so that can be a way to support the channel. Links to other sources, I don't have any kind of affiliated relationship with, like Dick Blick, for example. So Amazon links are the ones I see money from. Everyone else I don't see anything from. And another thing, thinking about that, kind of thinking about how cool it would be to have sponsors and to have those kind of partnerships. My sponsors on this channel are my amazing patrons on Patreon. Their help and support helps make tutorials like this one, especially tutorials that consume a lot of materials or consume a lot of time, possible. So if you enjoy the watercolor crash course and you'd like to help me continue to make and share content here on YouTube, you can join me at patreon.com/natosoup. My other sponsor isn't really a sponsor, but it is the reason for doing any of this at all. It would be my watercolor comic 7-inch Kara. You can read it for free at 7inchkara.com. Let me know what you think. Or, as you guys can see, we've got some dead trees in our hands. You can order volume 1 and volume 2 through the Natto shop. And if you can't afford to order your own copies, I totally understand. Another amazing way to help support 7-inch Kara would be to fill out a library request form at your local library. It costs you nothing. However, it lets them know that there are people interested in reading this beautiful watercolor comic, and it helps me sell an additional book. So I'll just flip through it real quick, but as you guys can see, it is entirely in watercolor, and it's one of the big driving forces for learning how to watercolor, as well as finding the right watercolor paints for this project and for the other illustration projects that I work on. So if this looks good to you, if this looks interesting, I hope you guys will head on over to 7inchkara.com to learn more about it. And finally, if you like tiny people tales, if you're enjoying 7-inch Kara, I hope you will check out Lilliputian Living. This is based on 4 years of Lilliputian Living zines. It's a project I do every October. So as you guys can see, we have a prompt, we have an illustration, and we have some prose to go with it. And I have started volume 2, so this is a project I'm really proud of. You guys might recognize some of these illustrations from different field tests, because often I will re-ink them and paint over them to test out different paints. So this could be a great way to get the lore behind the Lilliputian world. So the materials we are working with today are, I'm going to be painting with the Vinci mixing set. So you guys might remember this set from some of our prior watercolor crash course. This set has 12 colors. I never use this white. I really need to replace it with a dioxine purple, but otherwise it's a pretty dang good selection of colors, and I think it's going to work well for the field of wildflowers that we're going to be painting. We're going to be painting on Fluid 100 cotton rag watercolor paper. This is technically block bound in that it is attached at the top and bottom. It is not attached at the sides. And I'm working with this today because, as you guys can see from the price point, it's a more accessible watercolor paper. It's a little bit cheaper. And I purchased this pad down at David's, my local brick and mortar art supply store, but you can find this online as well. We're also going to be working with a couple of ceramic palettes that's going to allow us to mix our color and to color control. Ideally 2 cups of clean water, but I have limited space, so I'm going to be working with 1 today. We're also going to be working with masking fluid, and I'm going to have it in a dinky dip. That's going to allow me to control the amount of masking fluid that I'm using. We're also going to use masking fluid pickups later on to remove our masking fluid once it's dry. And we're also working with a variety of brushes, many of which we talked about in the materials crash course. So I've got a mop, I've got a flat, I've got a couple of quills, I've got some rounds, and I also have a synthetic round that I'm going to use to apply my masking fluid later. And speaking of masking fluid, I also have some brush soap, and I'm going to apply this to my synthetic brush so that it doesn't absorb all that masking fluid. But this particular container, I'm going to use this to prop my illustration up just slightly so that gravity helps me out. So now that we've talked about our sponsors and we've talked about our materials, let's get started with our watercolor painting. So I'm going to be working from several different references. You can literally Google field of wildflowers and you'll have lots of reference. I'm not necessarily painting any one specific photo. This isn't intended to be a photorealistic tutorial. This is more just a demonstration of different techniques and how they might be used in your watercolor painting. And of course, I've got some other great watercolor step-by-step tutorials at different levels. So whether you're a beginner or you're more advanced or you're interested in learning how to paint your own watercolor comics, I've got tutorials for all that, and I'll have that linked down in the description below as well. So grab your paints, grab your paper, and let's get painting. We're going to start by prepping our workspace a little bit. I'm propping up my pad of watercolor paper on the Old Masters brush soap just to kind of get it lifted a couple of inches. That's going to allow gravity to help us out with the graduated wash we're going to be doing. I also spritz some water on my paints to activate them, and using a small sauce dish. That's right, I definitely raid the Asian food mart for some of my watercolor supplies. I am mixing some Ultramarine Blue into some clean water so that we have something to work with for our wash. And I want to get it fairly saturated. So I am starting with a fairly saturated, almost matte tone mix of our ultramarine blue. Then I'm moving in with our pre-mixed ultramarine blue, slightly less saturated, and then using some clean, next I'm going to go back in while it's still wet and kind of clean up that graduated wash. And then at the bottom, I'm going to use clean water to kind of blend that wash out. And this is kind of a cheater technique. Using a clean paper towel, I am dabbing up some small clouds while my paint is still wet. So we're lifting out our clouds. This is a really simple technique for very easy clouds. So next I'm going to do a Toon Tone gradient, and I'm using a small ceramic plate from Dollar Tree as my mixing surface here. I apply a strip of yellow and then I wash it out into our blue using clean water. And then I bring it down towards the bottom of the page. This is going to be the area where our wildflowers and grass are. I'm going to add some more yellow back into our wet area and extend our water line into the clouds. Then I'm going to use some phthalo blue to start adding the graduation from the bottom into the yellow so that we get kind of this greenish middle color there in the center. And this is something that kind of takes a little bit of practice to get used to. So I'm going to kind of go back and forth with my yellow, my blue, my clean water, just blending it out. I allowed it to dry fully, and next we're moving on into Wet Into Wet. And I am starting using a round brush, and I'm really utilizing the shape of the brush to kind of create these dagger-like forms. These are the blades of grass. And this would technically be wet over dry, but this is just a start. We're gonna add in some phthalo blue as we start painting in our grass. Now, I do have a few reference images open, but I'm not working from any one in particular. And if you're looking for more wildflower tutorials, I have a few other videos on how to paint wildflowers or fields of wildflowers that I hope you guys will check out. I'm not trying to cover the entire area, and I am working with a fairly small round brush because that allows me to really accentuate the grass shapes, the blades of grass. I'm working from top to bottom. Next, I mixed in some phthalo blue while it's still wet, and you guys can see it kind of diffuse out. Now, something I like about this technique is some areas are going to dry a little bit faster than others. I live in Southeast Louisiana, so we have a lot of humidity, but I also run the air conditioner, which dehumidifies the air. So some areas are going to dry faster than others. So some areas we're going to be doing dry over dry or wet over dry. So we're going to get more distinct grass / blade-like shapes. And in other areas, it's still wet. So we're going to get more of a diffused blend. And I feel like this adds a lot of visual interest compared to if I just waited for the page to dry entirely and then went in with our phthalo blue. But you guys can see that the colors have already started to mix together to create our green. I'm going to go in again, wet over dry. It dried a bit. And I am doing another layer of our phthalo blue brush strokes. And some of them I'm kind of isolating from the whole mass. So it kind of reads like the blue shadows of the grass are kind of reaching up into the grass as it recedes away from the viewer. So if you're interested in using atmospheric perspective to improve your painting or improve your drawing, I have some tutorials on atmospheric perspective from my Making Comics and Zines series that I hope you guys will check out. So I want to kind of loosen things up, so I spritzed it with some water, and I'm going to add in a little bit more phthalo blue. Now I want to introduce some water blooms. So using a quill and some clean water, I'm dabbing in the water at the bottom to encourage the paint to sort of bloom and blossom out. So what this does is it basically pushes the pigments away from the water, and it's going to create these areas of runs, of bleeds, of blooms, and areas where the paint is lighter. I allowed that to dry a bit, and now I'm going to be doing some glazing into wet. So glazing basically just refers to any wet over dry application where your wet layer is a very thin mix. There's not a lot of paint to the water. And this allows us to kind of layer colors on top of each other and optically blend our colors. So once that's dried some but isn't fully dry, I'm going to sprinkle in some kosher salt, and we're going to get some salt blooms. This is going to be pretty subtle on this piece. So that is a time lapse of it drying, so you guys can start to see like almost like the snowflake effect. And I'm using a drafting brush and then my fingernail to remove the excess salt from the paper once it's dried fully. So the trick to working with salt blooms is you don't want the paper to be sopping wet, you don't want it to be puddles, but you do want it to be damp, because like with the water, the salt is going to push pigment away from where you sprinkled the salt. So next we're going to use some masking fluid. I have mine already poured out into a small dinky dip cup. I like to work with the Winsor & Newton's removable masking fluid. That's important because they make non-removable kind, so I feel like I always have to point that out. I'm using a synthetic brush, and I've applied some of the Old Masters brush soap to the bristles to protect the bristles from the masking fluid. You don't want to use a watercolor brush that you particularly love for this. Now I'm starting by doing kind of blade-like strokes of grass. These are going to leave those blades of grass more highlighted as we add in additional layers. Once I've finished masking out blades of grass, I'm going to do a splatter technique where I just tap on my brush and it will splatter masking fluid. I allow it to dry fully, and one of the ways you can tell it's dry is you can't see it anymore. And then I'm applying a clear glaze of water because we're going to be doing some wet into wet techniques, and I really wanted that. So we're doing a splatter technique with various colors that are going to kind of represent our wildflowers as they recede into the distance or as they are further behind blades of grass. So I'm splattering various colors into our wet application. So I am splattering in some red, some blue, a couple of different yellows, and a pre-mixed purple. The purple was mixed using magenta and ultramarine blue. I allowed that to dry fully, and then I'm going back in and doing another masking fluid splatter. I'm trying to demonstrate as many different watercolor techniques in one piece as possible. So next we're going to use some sap green, and we're going to do a glaze. So remember, it's not a super thick application of paint on top of dry paper. You still want some of the undercolors to still be visible. So that allows the colors to kind of mix optically, and that gives us that really fun chromatic effect that watercolor is capable of. If you paint too thickly with your watercolor, in a way you might as well use gouache, because you're going to lose a lot of the liveliness that makes watercolors so much fun. It's also far less economical. Watercolor is really designed to be used with a lot of water and just a little color. That's why the water is first in the phrase watercolor. So I allow my glaze of sap green to dry somewhat, and then we're going to do some wet into wet with our flowers. And this is going to diffuse again kind of softly into the grasses, implying that they're a little bit further away from the viewer. And it's a good way to kind of imply a mass of flowers because they softly diffuse. Now, keep in mind, we have masked off a lot of areas, so that's going to kind of create like areas of light and darkness, and that's going to add a lot of visual interest. I'm using the same colors that I used for the initial layer, so Ultramarine Blue, Vinci Red, Hansa Yellow Deep, a mix of magenta and ultramarine blue to create a purple. I want some colors that are a bit opaque and they're going to stand up a little bit better to the background. They're going to be still vibrant and still visible. So as you guys can see, I'm really building up those layers of flowers, and also as I progress, I'm adding in tighter details and using less water. And one of the reasons you might want to do this is because it's going to allow you to add details without it turning to mud. So I'm using some yellow ochre to kind of add some almost golden grass to the top. I'm also going to add some thicker phthalo blue. And when I say thicker, I mean there's more pigment mixed with the water. So in oil terms, this would be like fat over lean. So I'm applying some phthalo blue more thickly down at the bottom to kind of create those shadows and to kind of create that lush depth. Like if you were at almost like eye level to the grass, it would start to get darker as it moved away from the sunlight and as the grass cast shadows on the ground. So once everything's dried fully, I'm going to use a masking fluid pickup to remove our masking fluid. Some people can use their fingers. It doesn't work for me. So a masking fluid pickup actually works really well. It allows me to pick up teeny tiny little splatters that would be really difficult. And I found that I have fewer problems with the paper tearing if I use the pickup than if I just use my fingers. And we were painting on a block this whole time because, as you guys saw, we did a lot of water and a lot of layers. And realistically, a block that's bound on all four sides would hold the paper tight so you don't have to stretch it. But I do have some tutorials on how I stretch watercolor paper, particularly how I stretch paper for comics, if you would prefer to use other techniques. So this mostly just requires some patience. It needs to be fully dry before you remove the masking fluid, otherwise it's more likely to tear. And you need to work, this has all been time-lapsed by about 4. So this looks a lot faster than it is, but removing masking fluid, if you rush it, you're more likely to tear the paper. But you guys can see how as I remove the masking fluid, we start to see those kind of highlights of the grass emerging. Now that I've removed the masking fluid, I can start to add in some of the final details. So working dry over dry, I'm going to start painting in the flowers, really relying on the brushwork to try and capture the distinct shape. So for this kind of painting, it's really like caricature. We're trying to capture the characteristics that make those flowers look the most like what they are without getting too far into the weeds, painting all the teeny tiny little details. Sometimes you can really bog yourself down trying to capture everything perfectly when you're not working in the right size for that, or you don't have the skill set for that, or it just doesn't suit your style. And since I'm a comic artist and I am cartooning all the time, it's only natural that I would also be cartooning when painting wildflowers and exaggerating certain features. So we have some tall spiky flowers. They might be snapdragons, they might be lupins. This isn't a type of flower we get a whole lot around in Louisiana, so I'm not super sure what it is, but I'm using ultramarine blue mixed very thickly, so a little bit of water to my paint so that it stands up quite a bit better against the other layers that we've painted. Some of the opacity of that ultramarine kind of shines through, and I'm just kind of painting. It's almost like pine tree or fir tree shapes is what I noticed these flowers have. And I'm just going to kind of work my way through the different flowers in my reference. So some Vinci Red might be for some poppies. The Hansa Yellow Deep might be for some marigolds. The magenta / ultramarine blue blend might be for, they had these like tiny purple flowers in a lot of the references, so that might work well for that. A brighter yellow, like the yellow all the way to the end that you guys can actually see, might be really good for like teeny tiny little field wildflowers. So, you know, just kind of working from your reference. We're not aiming to copy the reference, but we're using it as inspiration and to inform our painting choices, and how we handle the flowers themselves can make it look, while still cartoony and still fairly easy to paint. This is one you could definitely paint along with me. It makes it feel a little bit more like we're painting a real place, even though this has been, you know, fabricated almost out of whole cloth for the purposes of demonstrating different designs. So I'm really utilizing the round that I'm painting with here to kind of, I'm really leaning heavily on letting the brush do the work. And this is something that's quite a bit prevalent in, say, Chinese watercolor, where the brush shape and the brush marks are a lot of the painting, and I find that really inspiring, and that's something I've been trying to work more and more into my work so that it feels more organic and it feels more painterly, and it doesn't feel as color by numbers as it has in the past. So I've mentioned this in some of my other watercolor tutorials or my other watercolor walkthroughs, but basically we do fat over lean with watercolor because if you put a glaze, if you put a really thin wash of color on top of paints that were applied fairly thickly, they're very likely to reactivate and to kind of smear and muddy, and that can actually be a very valid and useful technique. Often I'll introduce a spray bottle to my work to get the colors to move around and to kind of mingle together and to kind of loosen things up, but it should be a deliberate choice you're making rather than an unhappy accident. It should be a technique you're aware of and you know when to utilize it, and you're utilizing it by choice rather than an oopsie that you have to correct later on. So I'm splattering in a little bit of much lighter yellow just to kind of liven things up a bit, and then I allow it to dry, and I can go in and add some final like brush strokes to imply the grass kind of overlapping some of the flowers, because I'm really trying to build up the distance and the sense of depth with this. And sometimes you will continue to find masking fluid as you go. Just allow the area to dry and use your masking fluid pickup to remove it. It's not really a big deal. I'm an adult woman with ADHD, and patience is something that I have in very short supply. And people have asked me time and again how I can do so much watercolor painting, how I can stand to paint an entire watercolor comic. And honestly, it's really not that bad. The dry times are only the worst on really rainy evenings, and there's a few different ways you can kind of combat that, whether it's by cranking your AC to be blowing a bit more, put your painting under a vent so it can dry, using a hair dryer to to dry your painting, although don't do that if you've got masking fluid on it because it'll make it permanently affixed to it. Or you can purchase a dehumidifier and dehumidify your house, or you can just go do something else for a while you wait for paint to dry. I do, however, find painting to be very grounding, to be very comforting, and to be very relaxing. It's kind of my happy place, and hopefully my watercolor crash course has helped you guys find watercolor a bit more approachable and a bit more accessible. So I'm mostly just adding final details here. I'm darkening some of the shadows down at the bottom with some phthalo blue. I've added in some of the cooler yellow at the top to kind of imply that the sun's hitting it. I'm going to add in a little bit of yellow ochre and burnt sienna to kind of represent some of the more dry grasses that you sometimes see in a field of wildflowers. But at this point, it's really just a matter of personal taste and what you feel like the painting needs. You can definitely overwork it, but that can also be a good opportunity to practice different techniques and learn different things. Not every watercolor painting has to be amazing. This one is fine. It's fine, but it's not anything like impressive or exciting, but it was a great opportunity to demonstrate several different watercolor techniques for you guys without worrying too much about painting something so strictly representational. I have one more standalone tutorial / demo coming up in this series where I'm going to use 2 cameras to demonstrate color mixing and color handling. So if you've got questions about that, make sure you stay tuned for that. And I'm also going to do my troubleshooting segment as a live stream so I can answer your questions live and do some live demos. So finally, when you see me pull out the white gouache, that is your cue to we're just about done. I am just going to add a little bit of splatter of white gouache to kind of imply maybe like baby's breath or really small little flowers. It also lightens things up a little bit. When you add white gouache, it kind of changes the color balance. When everything has fully dried, I'm going to use a palette knife to remove my watercolor paper from my watercolor block. It's pretty easy. You just insert and pull. You can use a butter knife if you don't have a palette knife, but palette knives are pretty cheap and they work so well for this. And there we have it, our finished watercolor painting. Today we covered several common watercolor techniques, and hopefully I was able to demonstrate them in a way that makes sense. Sometimes those like, here's a bunch of watercolor technique videos doesn't really show the full potential for what those techniques can do. So hopefully this step-by-step helped you guys see how some of those techniques could be used in your own watercolor art and illustration. But if you are looking for more tutorials, I've got so many tutorials for you guys. So this here was inspired by 2 stash busters I shared. So here we have a simple how to paint wildflowers stash buster. So you guys can see a lot of commonalities between the two. And then we also have a how to create foliage by using atmospheric perspective. And you can see some commonalities between all 3 of these. And then I used some of the techniques that were demonstrated in these 3 when I did the 2 Easter stash buster bookmarks, the chick and the rabbit. And then if you've watched the channel for a while, you guys might remember when I was painting Easter eggs with watercolors, I demonstrate some really simple yet pretty floral shapes that would work well on those eggs. These same shapes would really work well in this kind of illustration as well. And these are all brushwork heavy. And what that means is we're really reliant on our round and how we hold our round and how we apply our brush strokes to create our shapes rather than just kind of filling it in. And this is a direction I've been trying to work in more and more. And talking about watercolor, I really hope you guys will check out my own watercolor comic, 7-inch Kara. You can read it at 7inchkara.com, or you can order your own copies or copies for somebody that you love through the Natto shop at nattosoup.com/shop. Thank you guys so much for joining me for another installment of our watercolor crash course. Today we use these 12 different, well, not all of these, but most of these techniques to paint a field of wildflowers. If you're looking for more fun and easy watercolor tutorials. I really hope you guys will check out my watercolor stash buster series. I'll have it linked down in the description as well as in the cards. I'm also going to have the materials used in today's demonstration linked for you guys as well. But if you're interested in learning more about watercolor materials, you can either check out my watercolor crash course on the basic materials we need for painting, or you can bring all your questions to my troubleshooting live stream that I'm going to be hosting at the end of this series. I have one more pre-recorded installment that I'm going to be working on where I'm going to have a camera pointed at my palette as I'm mixing the colors, and hopefully that'll answer some of your questions about water control, color mixing, that sort of thing. If you can actually see what I normally cut out just because it doesn't fit on camera. So hopefully you guys will look forward to that. I want to thank you guys so much for joining me today. I also want to join my super handsome assistant Joseph for being very generous and holding the techniques for me. You guys who watched some of my other watercolor crash course videos know how much I struggled to hold this thing on camera. So super big thanks to him for holding on to it for me. Hopefully today's installment of Crash Course was helpful, useful, and informative in helping you guys make art a habit. That's really important to me. If you guys enjoyed it, make sure you leave a big old thumbs up. And if you're new here, hi, welcome. I'm Becca. As you guys probably know by now, I think I introduced myself earlier. I'm a little ADHD, so I do tend to forget those things sometimes. But it would really mean a lot to me if you enjoyed what I do here and you want to stick around. If you would click that subscribe button and hit the bell notification to let YouTube know that you want to see more from me. Tutorials and walkthroughs and demos and courses like this one are made possible thanks to my amazing patrons whose names you'll see now.